side on the fiscal risks, on the market implications, as well as corporate governance. I hope this is a type of report that we will do many more of in our region, because we have for some years now been trying to elevate our engagement around SOEs, because they're critical not only for service delivery but also for productivity in the economy, and as well as financial sustainability. So I'm really happy to see this. The second point I wanted to make is that the SOE agenda is a very much multi-sectoral shared agenda. You know, when you look at the potential fiscal risks that SOEs can bring to an economy, either through guarantees, debt guarantees, or subsidies, or financial losses in general, one would think that they are critical from the macro side, from the fiscal risk side. But when you look at the other side of market distortions and other roles of SOEs, we can also see why they're relevant for private sector investment, private sector development, market and competition. And indeed, the other sector, service delivery, because they are involved in providing services in various sectors, and the extent to which they're efficient and well-run would matter in terms of how well they deliver those services and how competitively they deliver those services. So I think this is an agenda that not only unites our team within EFI, but it's also a shared agenda with others, human development, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So I'm really glad to see this. What I like about the report is really that it diagnoses, but it offers very clear policy recommendations. I think, I was really impressed with the detailed SOE by SOE analysis, but also then kind of generalizing a bit from that to offer 3 or 4 clear policy recommendations that can be implemented. I hope that the government finds this very useful, and I hope not only would it find it useful, but that some of the recommendations can be acted upon. So with that, let me hand over back to you, Edward, with big thanks to Mawish and team again for doing a fantastic report.
Thank you very much, Abebe. Let me acknowledge the presence of Faye Borofise, our resident representative in the Gambia, but also IMF colleagues, colleagues from government state-owned enterprises, and add that the session is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. And so our colleague Hadija will actually share the link on the chat. So over then with the main speaker today, Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs, Government of the Gambia, PS Abdoulaye Jallow.
Yes, thank you very much. And good morning to all of you. This is Abdoulaye Jallow, Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. Good morning to all of you. And then good morning to the World Bank Regional Director, the Director for IMF African Department, the country representative in the Gambia, Faye, the staff of the World Bank who has worked diligently to deliver this important instrument for the government of the Gambia, managing directors and representatives of SOEs who are present here, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, all other protocols duly and respectfully observed. It is indeed a pleasure to be invited for the launching of the Integrated State-Owned Enterprises Framework Assessment which is dedicated, in this case, specifically for the Gambia. Let me also, first of all, express our gratitude in choosing the Gambia as one of the first countries to be piloted for the use of iSOEF methodology to assess the country's SOE sector, as well as to congratulate the World Bank team on the outstanding work that they have done to come up with such a thorough and comprehensive report. As the iSOEF report has clearly highlighted, SOE performance in the Gambia has been lagging behind over the years. That is mainly characterized by low returns, widening losses, weak governance framework, low quality service delivery, and inadequate oversight, which all culminated in fiscal pressures on the national budget, along with growing public fiscal risk. In fact, by the end of 2017, total liabilities from SOE were estimated at 31% of GDP, with NAWEC, the National Water and Electricity Company, accounting for nearly half of that total liabilities. This has also coupled with the fact that government has spent an amount equivalent to 1.5% of GDP to service NAWEC debts over the past few years. Meanwhile, SOEs paid only 0.23% of GDP in taxes on average during 2016 and 2019. However, since the new government took over in 2017, we have relaunched our SOE agenda with the goal of strengthening SOE oversight functions and reducing SOE's direct and implicit burden on public finances. And to achieve this goal, we commenced by conducting a special SOE forensic audit carried out by renowned international audit firm, Ernst & Young. The audits reveal a wide range of issues, including insolvency, weak accounting systems, overstatement of assets, conflicting commercial and socio-economic objectives, and various corporate governance issues. Therefore, the release of this report, which is the iSOEF report, is quite timely, given the fact that we are in the midst of addressing these mounting challenges affecting the financial and operational performance of our state-owned enterprises. Key among the reform agenda in the formulation of is the formulation of a legal and regulatory framework. The new SOE bill, or the SOE bill, will replace the existing Public Enterprise Act of 1990 and will help to strengthen governance and oversight of state-owned enterprises. The bill, which was recently submitted to Parliament or the National Assembly, is in line with international best practice and was extensively discussed with our development partners, including the World Bank and the IMF. It centers mainly on strengthening the legal and regulatory framework for ownership, governance, financial and operational oversight of state-owned enterprises. As a result, once approved by the National Assembly, it will lead to the establishment of a state-owned enterprise commission to serve as an oversight and regulatory body for all state-owned enterprises. It will address some of the following issues: the selection of SOE Board of Directors to include the necessary technical, financial, and management expertise directly relevant to the operations of SOEs, the establishment of a transparent appointment process, regular monitoring and
Introducing the assessment and what are the key messages that have come out when we assessed Gambia against this iSOEF methodology. And then we will move to the second subsection in which we would present three sectors: energy, aviation, and telecommunications, as per the assessment that we have done. Lastly, the section we will present would be about the reform options that we have suggested in the report. So let's start with the first subsection. So as Abebe was mentioning, and Edward also mentioned at the start, the Gambia iSOEF is the first comprehensive application in Africa. It doesn't mean that this iSOEF methodology hasn't been used in Africa before. It's just that we have used most of the modules in assessing the Gambia SOEs. 3 out of 4 modules that are available in the iSOEF methodology, which follows a modular approach. The first module is about SOEs and the markets, which focuses on competitive neutrality and market distortion aspects. The second module that we have used in the Gambia is on fiscal impact, in which we discuss fiscal costs, risks, and long-term fiscal impact from the SOE sector. In the fourth module, we discuss 6 would be viable for the private sector participation. However, the good news is that only 2 SOEs are in the national monopoly sectors where there is a strong rationale for state intervention. These 2 SOEs are NOVIC, the energy and the electricity and water utility, as well as the postal services. When we look at the financial performance of the SOE portfolio, and specifically the indicator, the profitability indicator of earnings before taxes, we do see that the SOE portfolio as a whole, on average, during 2017 to 2019, has been incurring losses, which is about 0.7% of GDP on average. And we also noticed that the latest published audited financial statements for all SOEs that have been approved by the National Assembly are from 2019. So there is still quite a lag on the financial reporting. On the fiscal cost side, we have seen that SOE sector has been bailed out frequently in the past, the most prominent being the 8% of GDP bailout that was provided to the energy utility in 2019. We also see that the fiscal transfers or the budget transfers to the SOE sector over the last 3 years, 2018 to 2020, has averaged more than 1% of GDP. And if we try to kind of analyze these expenditures on SOEs from the budget in the matrix of health or education, we do see that these expenditures are kind of equal to 3-4 1/4 of the health expenditure or 1/3 of the education expenditure, which means that these non-productive spending is crowding out the essential spending that's needed to improve the welfare and poverty reduction in the country. When it comes to service delivery, we see that the sectors in which the SOEs perform, how are they faring? And we do see that in the electricity access arena, Gambia still ranks very low at 121 out of 141 countries. The capacity of the port to handle cargo has outgrown, and the waiting time right now at the port is on average 10 days, or can go up to at least 22 days in some cases for loading or unloading cargo. When it comes to telecom, we see that the internet use is just 20% for a country which has more than 60% youth population. And if we kind of project this existing SOE portfolio scenario into future, looking ahead, what does it look like? In terms of our assessment, and based on the data and estimates that were available when we did our assessment, we can find that if it's business as usual, or if there are no reforms to the SOE sector, the fiscal cost potentially could be as high as 5% of GDP per annum over the next decade. If there are some reforms, the good news is that those reforms would reduce the cost to 3.7% of GDP, notably the reforms that are currently happening and planned for NAVIC in the energy sector, but that is still quite high by any standard and do merit substantial and urgent action.
Now, the presence of these SOEs has also implications in terms of the signals for the private investors and as well as for competition. What are the risks that we found as part of the report? Well, first, the SOEs are required to have these public service obligations and at the same time operate in competitive segments. Why is this important? Well, because if you have some of the resources, for instance, coming through GCC, that is the Groundnut Corporation, who receive subsidies for providing the fertilizers and the technical assistance to the farmers, but at the same time, you have the competitive mandate to compete and export groundnuts. There are strong risks of crop-subsidization, and then it means that it distorts the prices and the pricing mechanism that is actually operating in the market. What is the second risk? Well, that the SOEs are also not required to achieve a specific rate of return. What does it mean? Well, that not all of these companies have the market-based incentives to improve and to operate in the same rules as the private peers. They can even operate with profits as with losses, and for those with losses, as we will present as part of the report, these losses means substantial and recurring flow of funds from the state to these companies to continue these loss-making companies operating in the markets. Third, we also observe that the SOEs have the dual role with regulatory functions. This means that some of these companies are at the same time the market operator, but also are the regulator who has the power to determine the prices, or who has the power as an incumbent to determine who enters or who does not enter into the market through licensing of permits. One example is the GCAA, but also the Groundnut Corporation can have the ability of the clearance, the final clearance, to determine who comes into the groundnut sector. And fourth, the SOEs also benefit from different market discipline and different terms of access to capital. For instance, they can access through subsidized loans, through other SOEs, or through the pension fund, or through capital injections of the government directly that are not available for the private competitors that are in the same market. There are also some cases in which these SOEs can access free of charge to some essential facilities. Why this matters? Well, because all in all, these are strong signals about the distortions of the cost of capital, different operation costs that at the end of the day unlevel the playing field for the private sector that is interested in coming into the Gambia.
So the Gambia faces several SOE corporate governance issues. And as PS Jallo had mentioned in his remarks, we look at 6 dimensions of corporate governance aspects. And on the legal and regulatory framework, the current legal and regulatory framework in the Gambia is quite fragmented, and it comprises of several different legislations. And as PS Jallo had mentioned, and now a new draft SOE bill was prepared in 2019 and is going to be submitted for approval. This bill defines the governance framework more in line with international standards, and the expectation is that the provisions under this SOE bill will prevail over any similar provisions of SOEs. And as he had mentioned, it proposes a new SOE commission. On the ownership and oversight function, this is we found that this is dispersed among several entities, including line ministries, the Ministry of Finance, MOFIA, and the Department of Strategic Policy and Delivery at the Office of the President. Such fragmentation of ownership responsibilities affects the consistency in ownership approach, and it undermines and it could undermine accountability issues. So a new directorate for SOE oversight within MOFIA has been established to ensure effective oversight of the corporate governance, fiscal and financial management, and of course, SOE performance. So when the SOE bill is approved and enacted, the new SOE directorate would be converted to a centralized SOE oversight institution under the authority of the SOE Commission. On performance agreements, so these are fairly recent in the Gambia, and it was piloted with NAWEC in 2020, and it was in collaboration with MOFIA, the Ministry of Energy, and NAWEC's board, in addition to several external consultants. Monitoring this has been a bit limited due to the lack of reliable information, limited mechanisms to track the performance against KPIs and others. So for this, they are focusing on monitoring and evaluation going forward. And based on this development, the government plans to roll out performance contracts to more SOEs in the near future. On the board of directors, so we found that the board composition and the background or qualifications of the board vary among the SOEs, and we found that the nomination process of the board members can also be strengthened. And there's really a need to ensure that boards have the competencies and the objectivity to carry out their duties. So at the moment, in many cases, members are not selected based on a clearly defined professional criteria. And a lot of the key responsibilities of the board are done by either the president's office or through the MOFIA, which could undermine the authority of the board. On transparency and reporting, so for the Gambia, the reporting disclosure aspects could also be strengthened. As Maywish had mentioned, the public disclosure of annual financial statements was often delayed by many years, and the most recent being the 2019. What we have seen is that in June 2021, there was the 2019 financial statements became available on MOFIA's website, which is a very positive development, and we hope this could continue every year. The application of accounting standards are different by SOEs, which makes it very difficult to compare financial information across SOEs and over time. While some SOEs are either applying or in the transition of IFRS, the rest are applying national accounting standards. And finally, on procurement. As Denise had mentioned, the Gambia Public Procurement Authority GPPA Act defines the procurement process to all procuring organizations, including the SOEs. So while the intention of the regulations is really to ensure that there is a competitive market for suppliers and there is a transparent process, but the challenge is really to make ensure that the procurement process is timely and efficient so that SOEs can respond quickly to market conditions.
So that brings us into the second subsection. Let's delve into the sector that we have identified. We'll start first with the national monopoly case in which NAVIC operates, which is by far the country's largest SOEs in terms of the assets. 1/3 of the total SOE assets belong to NAVIC. Half of the liabilities of the SOE sector also belong to NAVIC. When it comes to the financial performance, we do see that it has been incurring losses on average over 2017 to 2019, amounting to 0.4% of GDP. Despite the 2018 debt restructuring MOU that was delivered in 2019, the debt to equity ratio or the gearing ratio is still higher at more than 600%. Primarily because NAVIC still has a sizable debt stock and low equity, as you can see from the figure here in the slide. We also have another player, SOE, in the energy sector, which is the GNPC, which basically provides downstream petroleum services, especially to geographical locations that are away from the center of the country, the Greater Banjul area. Where there is negligible private sector presence. Their financial performance indicators you can see in the slide. The assets are 8% of the total SOE assets, liabilities are 3%, and they have also incurred on average a loss over the last 2017 to 2019. But we now know that they are turning around the utility and they have started generating profits in 2020. When it comes to the service delivery performance of the sector, we do see that the access to electricity for urban population has been at 80%, and for rural population it is at 27%, which is closer to the average for the sub-Saharan Africa region. And it's a good progress towards achieving universal access to energy. However, we do see that consumers face frequent blackouts, intermittent services, and one of the highest prices in SSAs. Particularly companies that are manufacturing fresh products, they kind of complain about the high cost of energy, and also the intermittent services are not helping them to streamline their production processes. Nonetheless, NAVIC has made some notable achievements in the very recent past to improve its operational and financial performance, such as the 2018 debt restructuring MOU that I discussed before, the 2019 cross arrears memorandum of understanding, the 2019 tariff methodology. They were the first ones to sign a performance contract in 2019, and they have also continued with that practice for 2020 and 2021. They have gone through major organizational restructuring. They have implemented an information management system. The process is still ongoing, and they have now embarked on financial modeling with some financial experts on the team. The outcome of these improvements on NAVIC financials, we do expect that these outcomes would be reflected in the next SOE analysis based on the data and the timeline that we had for this SOE framework assessment. We could not somehow reflect that because the NAVIC financials have not reflected the outcome from these reforms yet.
Well, NAVIC is indeed operating in a natural monopoly, but is also a highly vertically integrated company that operates from the electricity production until the distribution to the final consumer. Why does it matter? Well, because there are some segments like the electricity generation that could be open to the private investors, and that can also help to diversify the energy mix in the Gambia. Now, what are the constraints for the private investors to come into that sector? Well, the first reason that they declared to us during the mission is that the licenses are very complex and costly to get into the market, but also, despite the different regulatory changes implemented since 2005, that open the room for the private sector to come in, especially in the generation of electricity, there is still absence of interconnection rules. That means at the end of the day that the producers, the private sector producers that are investing into these clean technologies for creating new energy are not clear about the rules of the game, about where they will be able to connect to the interrelated grid for selling this energy. that is managed by NAWEC. At the end, all of this implies that the fuel is highly costly for NAWEC, and the energy mix is fully dependent on this fuel. Part of these fiscal implications of this company is because there are a lot of volatility in the prices of this fuel, and the government has to step in to compensate for those high volatile prices. This, at the end, translates also into the high prices for the consumers. They suffer with high electricity prices that are up to 20% higher when compared to their peers in the region. The coverage, as Mewis mentioned, is low, but also the industrial sector is suffering from intermittent services and common blackouts.
When it comes to the fiscal impact, NAWEC has represented a major fiscal drain over past years. If you see at the first table here in the slide, the tax arrears that NAWEC has was 0.2% of GDP in 2019, but it has improved to 0.02% in 2020, largely because of the cross arrears MOU that was signed with the government in 2019. Over time, subsidies have also gone down when it comes to NAWEC. The subsidies specifically that have been mentioned here for the 2019 and 2020 are not operational subsidies for NAWEC, but in fact, they are payments in lieu of the outstanding arrears. However, the external loan that has been on lent to NAWEC for capital investment and other capital working needs, the debt service on those loans have been borne by the budget directly. It has averaged 0.4% of GDP over 2018 to 2020, and there has been minimal reimbursement for NAWEC on those debt service. So this cost has come to the government directly without any reimbursement from the SOE. When it comes to the future outlook, NAWEC poses sizable fiscal risks, as the financial viability of the company depends on structural reforms that the government and the sector and the company itself needs to undertake. We have here analyzed the fiscal risks using the fiscal risk matrix. If you see at the left side, you would see that the direct explicit obligations primarily emanate from the external debt that has been on lent to NAWEC, which is almost 9.4% of GDP as of end 2021. The domestic debt that has been assumed by government, and government is now paying the debt service on that debt, is amounting, the stock of that debt is 1.2% of GDP. When it comes to the contingent explicit obligations, we know that NAWEC and GNPC, the two companies in the energy sector, they have contracted the IDFC, the Islamic Trade Financing Corporation credit facility, revolving credit facility, which has been guaranteed by the government, and it amounts to 1.6% of GDP, and that could pose a contingent risk in future. It has been realized in the past, but that has not been the case lately, and we do expect that it's not going to be the case in future, but it still is one form of risk on the outlook. When it comes to the implicit obligations, the tax arrears that are still outstanding, which is a small amount of NAWEC, as well as the outstanding employee pension contributions, on which we could not find very latest data, but it's still an obligation that could come as a form of, in the form of a fiscal risk. And on the contingent side of implicit obligations, these primarily relate to the operating losses of NAWEC, which have been estimated at 1.4% of per annum over the next 9 to 10 years. The capital investment that is required by NAWEC to improve generation, transmission, and distribution, as well as its other business needs, is almost 1.7% of GDP per annum. And the cross arrears that it has with other SOEs amounts to 1.2%. So if you can see from this matrix that there are a number of fiscal risks that emanate from this sector that needs to be looked into and that needs to be managed going forward. Now we discuss the case of the commercial or competitive sector, which is the transport sector that we have chosen here. In the transport sector, we have 3 SOEs operating in the country. The first SOE is the Gambia Ports Authority that basically handles port facilities and cargo. Then we have the Gambia Civil Aviation Authority that's mostly providing civil aviation services, and the Gambia International Airlines, which is providing airport ground and cargo handling services to the country. When it comes to the financial performance, you could see that the GPA and the GCAA, they are equally contributing almost 1/5 of the total SOEs. Assets and the liability of the GPA is 6%, relatively low, but when it comes to the GCAA, the Civil Aviation Authority, it's basically 20% of total SOE liabilities. GPA probably is the only SOE that has been incurring profits over time, 0.4% of GDP positive on average over 2017 to 2019. However, GCAA as well as the GIA, the international airline, they are at a loss of 0.3% of GDP and 0.01% of GDP respectively. The profits, it's important to note that the profits that the GPA has been generating, these profits are being reinvested on an ambitious expansion of infrastructure and services, which is very much needed. When it comes to the service delivery performance of the sector, we have specifically focused on the Port of Banjul, which is managed by the GPA, and we are all aware that it offers limited capacity to handle the current volume of cargo. We have mentioned the statistics of waiting time of 10 days on average. It goes up to 22 days in some cases. It causes frequent delays. It creates extra costs for consumers and producers, and it limits access to foreign markets, especially for perishable products. The port congestion is also increasing, as I mentioned, operating costs and generating significant service disruptions for the shipping lines who have revised their tariff and business models. And these revisions directly feed into import costs, and being an import-dependent economy of Gambia, these are feeding into inflation, primarily food inflation.
Well, the presence of these SOEs in the transportation sector and in the logistics sector had also a strong implication for the competitiveness of the exporters and importers in the Gambia. This is a very interesting case because it shows us that a profitable SOE is not always the same as to have a market efficient SOE. In this case, a GPA is the single company that is profitable in the Gambia, in the portfolio, and is very large, as Mewish was mentioning. The GPA concentrates the operations in the Port of Banjul that explain 80% of the commercial and international trade, and also the 60% of the imports of neighboring countries. However, what we observe is that there are so much more that can be done in terms of investment, and those profits can be also highly invested into the development of the capacity of the port. There is also some limitations in terms of air. When it comes to the transportation of exports by air, the Gambian International Airline is an airline, but they don't have cargo or passenger capacity to export by air. It is most a ground handling company that operates in the airport. And then what happens at the end of the day that the exporters face these delays and costs to export or import by sea, but also they rely heavily on the tariff and the tourist season to actually being able to send those shipments to the EU markets and to open new opportunities abroad. These exporters, for instance, in the terms of the fresh products, when we interview them in the mission, they mentioned that they are having to go all the way to Dakar Air or Dakar Airport to actually being able to deliver their products in time. So that means that given these constant delays, the congested port, the exporters are having to pay up to 3 times more for being able to put their products in foreign markets, but also that this congested mechanism is creating delays, which are creating risk for the exporters and importers, and they're assuming the cost of this. What are the options here? Well, GPA has a lot to offer. The port facility can be expanded, but then the private sector can be a very strong ally, for instance, through a PPP or a joint venture where they can also bridge some of the investment gaps to expand the port. That is very critical for widening the sector and opening the opportunities for the exporters in the Gambia.
On the fiscal impact side, as we mentioned, the GPA is the only profitable SOE. So as such, that's the only SOE that has been paying dividends to the government. When it comes to analyzing the fiscal transfers that has happened between the budget and this SOEs on the transport side, specifically the GPA, we do see that the tax arrears that amounted to 0.2% of GDP as of 2019 have all gone away. And to the best of our knowledge, the GPA has been current on its tax obligations. They have also provided dividends of 0.1% of GDP in 2020. But when it comes to fiscal risks, we do see that there are fiscal risks emanating out of this SOE because of its huge capital investment needs, as Denise was also mentioning. On the explicit obligations, which are the direct ones, we see that there is a 2.1% of GDP external debt that has been online to the Civil Aviation Authority. There might be a debt that has been contracted by GPA with government guarantee, but were not able to get the number for that, and that could be a contingent obligation on the budget. When it comes to implicit obligations, the employer payment pension contributions, that could be one of the source for these three companies that are still outstanding. And on the contingent side, the operating losses of the Civil Aviation Authority and the capital investment that is required by the GPA is about 1.3% of GDP per annum. And as Denise was mentioning, there is a scope to think about some PPP arrangements or some kind of private participation or investment to wean off that cost, that potential cost on the budget in the coming years, as well as the cross arrears with other SOEs are 0.2% of GDP. So that's basically some of the risks that have been quantified based on the data that was available that could be generated from the GPA despite being a profitable SOE for the budget. Now we turn to the case of contestable sector. As you know, we have kind of analyzed the SOE portfolio in the Gambia using three sector terminology. The first one was national monopoly, in which you saw the case of NAVEC. The second one was competitive sectors, in which we talked about primarily the port. Now we're talking about contestable sector. And in the contestable sector, we are talking about the sector of telecommunication, in which there are two main operators on the SOE side. One is the GAMTEL, the telecommunication, which is the primary provider of telecom services in the country and provides fixed line and broadband services, while GAMCEL, which is a cellular company, is basically a subsidiary of the GAMTEL, and it provides cellular services, and it's one of the country's mobile operators. In terms of their financial performance, the assets are almost combined assets are 10% of the total SOE assets. When it comes to liabilities, is almost like it's mirroring the asset composition. It's almost a little more than 11% of total SOE liabilities. When it comes to the profitability, they have incurred losses over the 2017 to 2019 on average, amounting to 0.04% of GDP and 0.1% of GDP respectively for both GAMTEL and GAMCEL. When it comes to service delivery performance in the sector, we do see that only 66% of active SIM cards use data. There are only 580,000 unique internet subscribers against 1.8 million active data SIM cards in the country. The monthly telecom-related expenditure is 2.6% for the poorest households in their baskets versus 1.7% for the richest households, meaning thereby that the cost is high of telecom services. Poor quality of 4G network services, and also when it comes to GAMCEL specifically, it's the least efficient on the 2G, 3G spectrum with more than 200 hertz per subscriber versus less than 50 by Africell, which is the largest market there in the Gambia and a private operator.
Well, we have to acknowledge that the sector has evolved very much over the last 5 years, especially with the separation of the independent regulator, PURA, and with different provisions that now allow the entry of the private sector in a highly concentrated sector in the past that was the international gateway. Despite all of these regulatory changes, there are still some nuances where the SOEs might be benefiting from different treatment. vis-a-vis the competitors in the telecom sector. What are those potential channels through which the SOEs can receive different treatment? Well, first, in terms of the enforcement capacity, the GAMTEL or GAMCEL can have different timelines of the payment for the interconnection fees that they have to pay to the regulator. Second, the SOEs can also benefit from subsidized loans through other SOEs or through the pension fund or through the government that are not available for the private competitors. In case of the private operators, they have to access to capital under commercial terms and the competitive rates, but that is not always the case for the SOEs in the telecom sector. Now, there is also an interesting fact about GAMTEL and GAMCEL, and is that GAMTEL is the parent company of GAMCEL, which is the mobile operator. These potential ownership structures also matter because sometimes the subsidiary can have access to these essential facilities in different terms compared to the private competitors. Now, what happens at the end of the day, given these distortions? Well, the private investors are not investing in developing new services that are highly needed in the country. This is impacting the performance of the sectors. And when it comes to the consumers, they are paying high prices compared to regional peers, and the connection speeds are more than 68% lower than compared to the regional peers.
When it comes to the fiscal risk assessment and the fiscal impact of this telecom sector, we do see that the tax areas that were estimated in 2019 for both GAMTEL and GAMCEL are at 0.6% of GDP, and they are still the same at 0.6% of GDP for 2020, meaning thereby that the clearance of the tax areas for these two companies has been slower than anticipated. And we do see going forward that there could be sizable fiscal risks due to the highly leveraged balance sheets of these two companies and the capital injection needs. Just to note here that we were able to find whatever data we could to analyze the fiscal aspect of this specific sector, but the data was limited. So please take these numbers with a bit of a pinch of salt. Explicit obligations, which are direct in nature, we do see that there is a loan that has been on lent to GAMTEL, which amounts to 2.1% of GDP as of end 2021, which could be a source of fiscal risk. If there are any debts that have been contracted with government guarantee for any of those two companies, that could become a contingent explicit obligation and could pose risks. In terms of the implicit obligations, we have the tax areas that are still at 0.6% of GDP and that need to be cleared. The outstanding employee payment pension contributions to the Social Security and Housing Finance Corporation. On the contingent side of implicit obligations, we have the operating losses for both the telecom and the cellular company, which is basically 0.3% per annum combined for both companies. The capital injection that is required by GAMCEL is around 1.1% of GDP in totality. It could be spread over years. And the cross areas that are still very much there existing with other SOEs are 0.06% of GDP, which is a little bit on the lower side. But when it comes to the capital injection requirement for GAMCEL and GAMTEL to stay afloat, that's quite a big cost, and it does not include or does not assume any reforms or any business expansion that these companies will undertake going forward.
I'll ask you to go through the section on SOE reforms and the path forward with some speed so that we can leave time for both the two discussants and some Q&A. I'm mindful of the time. We have a bit more than half an hour left.
Thank you so much, Edward. So as you may have seen from the presentation, there's really a lot to do and some very exciting opportunities ahead for the Gambia. And the iSOEF, based on the diagnostics, it really provides some very key main options for reforms that really focuses on improving the performance and the governance of SOEs while limiting fiscal costs and risks. So I don't want to go through everything because please, I mean, really, we encourage that you read the report, but maybe just very key points. One of the things that the team really thought was a priority was really strengthening the institutional arrangements for SOE financial oversight, because as we have heard, really, in order to address the various challenges, we really thought that there has to be a very strong ownership and oversight function. So really the list you see here focuses on how to really build and strengthen the capacity really of the new SOE Directorate, who will be really responsible and really overseeing a lot of these issues. So really strengthening the team because it's quite new, making sure that the Directorate is held as a centralized SOE oversight, making sure MOFIA and the SOE relations are strengthened, either by, really through regular meetings. And as we have heard, I mean, the SOE financial information is very important. So making sure that the new Directorate is able to collect that in a timely and comprehensive manner. Again, really building the capacity for collecting periodic and really doing the analysis on the financial side, and really keeping an updated annual record of net fiscal impact of SOEs on the budget. We spoke a little bit about the performance monitoring, so that's also very important in this aspect, and really building the capacity for periodic assessment of major fiscal risks associated to SOEs. And then again, really on the fiscal impact side, it's very, the team really, together with the government, really mentions that it's very important to systematize the SOE relationship with the budget to really calculate and compensate for their activities. And to do that, really make the financial relationships between the government and SOEs very transparent, and that SOEs are duly compensated for the actual cost of their public service obligations. And then, as we have also spoken about, really timely, accurate, and audited financial statements are one of the most important tools for monitoring and evaluating SOE performance. And so the third section, or the third aspect of main recommendations, focuses on this. So really about making sure that these financial statements are published on a regular basis on MOFIA's website, making and ensuring that there is the SOE report that's annually published on the MOFIA website, and really about making sure that there's a migration to IFRS for at least the top 5 SOEs, and then gradually maybe moving on to other SOEs.
Okay, and last but not least, some of the opportunities for recommendations to level the playing field and to bring in private sector investment in these sectors where we found presence of SOEs. The main recommendations are, of course, to ensure that the competitive neutrality principles are enforced in the market, that meaning that the SOEs are subject to the same market discipline as any other potential competitor, that the regulation is also analyzed with the eyes to open these opportunities for the private sector, for instance, to review the price regulations, to review the import monopolies that some of these SOEs have, in a way that these mechanisms that are surrounding the SOEs do not shield them from competition, but actually, if they are in the market, they can operate under the same market discipline and with market incentives to improve performance and to operate and deliver better services. Some of the opportunities as well are intermediate solutions like the PPP's arrangement or management or concession of some of these operations in a way that the government can still have the assets of these companies, but the private sector can work more on the management or the day-to-day operations, and how to bring more opportunities to level the playing field. Most of these recommendations are, of course, well detailed in the report. And thank you so much for your attention. Let us close there, and back to you, Edward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and detailed presentation. particularly the last 3 slides on the main takeaway and the sectoral diagnostics. Without further ado, let me move to the 2 discussants. And let me start with Mr. Théophile Yeboah. Mr. Yeboah is a senior manager at Main One for West and Central Africa. It's an Equinix company. And I assume he is present. I have indeed seen him. And then we'll move to the second discussant. I will ask you to please keep your points, your remarks straight to the point, so that we can maximize the time for the remaining time for Q&A. Mr. Yeboah, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. Sorry, give me a second. I'd like to share my screen. Let me know when you can see my screen.
We can see it, yeah.
Okay.
I'll just ask you to go through it speedily.
Okay, I will do. Thank you very much. So my name is Théophile, as you said. I'm based in Côte d'Ivoire, doing business development for Main One within the region. So actually, the reason why we are joining that session is to share our experience of telecom liberalization in West Africa. So in one word, who are we? We are a digital infrastructure service provider within the region, and we deliver service in data center and connectivity business communication. So our target is more on the telecom operators, ISPs, large enterprises, government institution, and small business. So this is what we've been doing since 2010 till date. So we grow the business from being we started with submarine cable infrastructure, growing the business as a communication player within the region. Today, we are more involved in the data center business. We had a look at the market and see what the telecom industry has provided in terms of GDP and job growth within the region. So look at the sub-Saharan Africa, we noticed that in the past years, recent years, the mobile ecosystem contributed to 2.5% of the sub-Saharan GDP, and totally 7.1% of the GDP in the region. So this shows that telecom industry, when it has a good environment to operate, can generate more revenue for a country. And also in terms of jobs creation, we can see the impact that has been provided within the region. So, but basically coming back to Nigeria, I'm trying to speed up. So we've noticed that the liberalization of the market started mainly in the 20s with the President Obasanjo. Initially, the business, the country economy was dwelling on oil and gas business. And then they seized the opportunity to open the market, allowing operating license to new players. So this has largely contributed to the development of the country. So we have noticed that the ICT sectors has contributed to 12.4% contribution to the national GDP in Nigeria. So we've noticed that in terms of ICT's job creation, this has also impacted a lot. And we noticed that when the telecom sector is liberalized, it has a positive impact on the economic diversification, as the sector is considered one of the major support services needed to promote growth and modernization for the sectors of the economy. So still in the process, we've noticed that in the penetration, the mobile broadband penetration in Nigeria has improved from 10% in 2015 to 41% recently in February this year. So we can see a kind of movement, a kind of big dynamism in the sector. It's true that many efforts have been made, but we still have some current bottlenecks in terms of infrastructure gaps. It's true that on the upstream side, today in Nigeria, we have a lot of submarine cables that's facilitating the access to the large band. But today, the main challenge is infrastructure. So we need more players, more parties to intervene, to invest in the infrastructure to fill the gap. And that's where Main One is contributing. And also, we need ICT skills gap to be filled. So we do have some challenges in terms of population group growth and urbanization, because today we notice that massive population growth put more pressure on the existing infrastructure. So there is a lack of infrastructure that we need to invest more, and we need more investors from the private sectors to help address the growing demand for data, and also because the technology is moving to another stage. In terms of impact, we do have some examples of economic and social transformation in other countries. The liberalization of the telecom sector has facilitated smart cities creation in some of the countries, the revenue growth, financial inclusion, even e-governance. Today, with some of the countries, apart from Nigeria, we can see those kind of products be developed in Cote d'Ivoire, in Senegal, in some other countries. E-education as well, e-health. So we have a lot of cross-sector broadband impact that can be addressed with those new changes. Today, major example in the continent, in South Africa and Kenya. Today, with the development of ICT, we're seeing the good fiber reach in country that is facilitating the development of the different sectors in South Africa. In Nairobi today, we have the digital finance that is a real success that they have been able to implement. And also today, Main One as an enabler of digital services within the region. So we invest a lot in terms of infrastructure. So we're investing now in data centers, in fiber. We have a lot planned for most of the countries. We have extended our footprint from Nigeria to Ghana. We did Cameroon, we did Cote d'Ivoire. Now, recently, we did Senegal as well. And Gambia is part of our plan. We're still investing in the business. We are covering today 9 West African countries. We are operating tier 3 premier data centers in the region. And we think that there's a lot to do. Main One can be of help to share its experience in the different markets with the key people in Gambia where it needs to be. We can provide our support, and we think that connectivity and digital service will impact many people and organizations throughout the Gambia. So when it's become a true digital powerhouse. So we think that there is a lot to do. And when the ecosystem favorizes, I think we see a kind of deployment in terms of growth, a kind of growth in the region where Main One can be of support. So I will take it there. I have to go quickly because of the time. So I think that the major information have been shared, but in other occasions, we have the time to go deeply in the details. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the main points came across. We appreciated the cross-regional and cross-sectoral perspective as the value adding from liberalization. And you can certainly respond to questions in the Q&A.
Sure.
Henri, over to you. Henri Fortin is our global lead at the World Bank on the reform of state-owned enterprises and otherwise a lead financial sector specialist. If you could make your points in somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes and keep your interventions focused on the comparative perspective and the main lessons that you see from the Gambia exercise. Merci.
Thank you, Edouard. Thank you for the invitation to the organizer. Congratulations to the team. Can you hear me, Edouard?
Yes.
Yeah. Congratulations to the team. They shared with me the report. It's really great. Greetings, by the way, from Bangui, Central African Republic. So at the opposite side from Banjul in the Africa West Central region, where we are hoping to bring to closure an integrated SOE assessment, among other things. And a lot of the points that were highlighted in the presentation by our colleagues resonated in the context of Central African Republic. I'll make 2 points. I'll emphasize 2 points that were discussed. I mean, I timed my remarks for 5 minutes, Edouard. So there's obviously a lot to do, and I want to also congratulate the authorities for making this assessment possible, but also some of the results are already quite impressive. I allude to one of them, you'll understand later, but the 2 points I want to make is, first, the critical importance of reporting, transparency, disclosure. That's really a foundational dimension. It's very difficult to do other things to build up corporate governance without addressing this. And obviously the authorities have started doing this, and this was picked up in some of the recommendations, especially Sandy highlighted. And the second one has to do with SOE restructuring. So on the transparency and disclosure, I think no one disputes the importance of transparency to build trust, to create accountability on the part of those who are in charge of managing the SOEs, and also those who manage the portfolio, not just the enterprises themselves. But the issue is really more complex than one might think. And there are several aspects that require careful attention. I'd like to highlight a few that I think are particularly relevant in the context of the Gambia. So at the level of the SOEs themselves, the financial reporting of the SOEs, I mean, the goal is to provide timely, relevant, and reliable financial reports on the economic performance and the financial situation of the SOE. So the first question that arises is to which standard? And I could see that all the right questions have been raised in the context of the Gambia. Here, I think the IFRS, that's the standard that the international community supports, including the World Bank. But we have to bear in mind that it's the golden standard. So it's the one that is used for the large corporations that are listed on the main exchanges around the world. So to achieve an orderly transition toward this golden standard requires quite a bit of time. So it's a very significant endeavor that will require the mobilization of the auditors, the financial staff, and the Ministry of Finance in the case of the government. The issue of consolidation, this is quite technical, but this is an issue we see in many countries. And I think it's really critical that the government, but also the SOEs address it to have the full picture. And I understand it's quite relevant in the Gambia because the large SOEs have many subsidiaries. Without this, I think you don't really achieve this objective of a relevant and reliable financial report. I mentioned the timeliness we see, which is maybe the third dimension. If information comes too late, I mean, it really loses most of its value. From that standpoint, and the standpoint also of the quality of the reports, I think another important consideration is to ensure that the SOEs have put in place the necessary infrastructure to be able to meet the required standard and to produce reports on time. And for that, I think there are several elements. The use of information technology and communication technology. We often see that this is a challenge. Equipping the SOEs with a well-prepared financial and accounting staff led by a chief financial officer. That's more not so easy. easier said than done. And I would say also the commitment of the management and the board of directors to the quality. So it's part of the tone at the top. Really, I mean, in successful corporations, you see that the CEOs, they are concerned with the accountability, ultimately, their accountability vis-a-vis the shareholder. I move to the second aspect within this first point, which has to do with the audits. This was also mentioned. So audits, we all use the word audits liberally, but I think it's important to discuss a few important aspects related to those independent audits. To be effective, an external audit has to meet maybe basically two key characteristics. One is independence of the auditor and the other one, competence. So there are several issues to consider in that regard to achieve this goal of having a competent and independent auditor. And this first one was mentioned in the report. I think it has to do with the selection and of the external auditor, but also the retention of the auditor, the question of rotation. For that, some objective criteria need to be set, supported by a robust process, which includes giving the shareholder, in the case of an SOE, the state, whichever agency is charged with the ownership / oversight function, to have a say in the final decision on appointment, reappointment. So it's a shared decision, but it's very important that the entity that ultimately has the most interest in receiving accurate audit reports with independence and competence has a say in the process. Once appointed, the auditors need to have access to management. So the auditors cannot just talk to the accounting staff. They have to have access to the board of directors, the audit committee, if there's one, and also to the shareholder, which again is the end user, and may also have, it's a two-way dialogue also. It can contribute, this dialogue with management, with the board, and with the shareholder, can contribute to the effectiveness of the audit process. So, and last but not least, the board, the shareholder, the management, all of them, they need to pay very close attention to what the auditors are saying in their reports, what they're saying verbally early on, but what is in the report is really of critical importance. The auditors, they tend to be very parsimonious in their words, but, and I can tell with certain confidence that this is not the case. This is often neglected in many countries. There are red flags that are raised by the auditors on the reliability of the financial statement, also on the organizational issues and internal controls. This is something that the Ministry of Finance, in the case of the Gambia, should really pay attention to, and to leverage this important process, which involves some cost, a lot of effort, and really not paying attention to what the auditors write in their report is really, it amounts to a significant amount of waste. Last but not least, and I won't elaborate on this, I think the publication, I mean, at the end of the day, if you produce financial statements, if they're audited, they're reviewed, monitored, but if they're not published, I mean, you lose a lot of value. So I really want to congratulate again the Ministry of Finance of the Gambia, because I looked up on their website, and I was able to find quite easily, and I can say it's not always the case. When we say it's published, sometimes it involves a very significant effort to get to that. So I think it's really important to create, again, the trust and the accountability to have those financial statements audited and published. I will note that, I mean, as of now, May 2022, we have the 2019 financial status. This is probably an area where of opportunities for improvements to enhance the timeliness of the report. So the second issue, as I mentioned, is SOE restructuring. And from that standpoint, we have, I mean, the point is that besides the ongoing effort to build up the corporate governance, the institutional framework for corporate governance on board, the legal framework, in some cases, when the SOEF is in a situation where its solvency is in question, its future is in question, it's not enough.
I have to tell you to wrap up.
Yes, I'm getting there. It's really important to, in addition to the effort to build up the corporate governance, to really restructure the SOE to have more short-term, immediate, and direct intervention to restore the SOE towards a viable path. So this is what the Gambia has done with the National Water and Electricity Utility. So another opportunity to congratulate the authorities. It was mentioned in the presentation. The bank provided support to this. This was a major undertaking that yielded tangible results. The new network, because I understand there were a lot of changes, sort of transformation of the utility with a new management team, with a procedure to appoint competent board members. They will need to be supported, and the effort that was undertaken the last year will need to be sustained. For instance, to give a practical example and go back briefly to the issue of the auditor, to make sure that the audit issue a clean bill of health, which is far from being the case, because right now, from the report that's published in the website, the auditor have issued a disclaimer of opinions, which is probably the worst grade they can give to a set of financial statements. So again, that will require some time. So SOEs are here to stay. We should really continue to support our partner countries in their efforts to make them more transparent and efficient, and that includes auditing, reporting, and also a range of other dimensions. Thank you very much. I'll stop at that. I'll be happy to elaborate on any point later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for both discussants. We may not have much time for elaboration. I'm going to open the floor for discussion, privileging questions from the government and from participants from the Gambia. So, ladies, gentlemen, the floor is open. Come forth with your questions. Some questions have been posted on the chat. PS Jallo, colleagues from the ministries, from the SOEs, please let us know your reactions. And some of us have a hard stop in 6 minutes. So let's see how much we can get out of the discussion.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi.
Just a moment. Let me see if PS Jallo or colleagues from the government have something, and then I'll give you the floor, Elizabeth.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything from you?
Yeah. No, I would suggest that maybe I'll come a bit last at the tail end, because there may be some other important questions that may require a response from government side. So that's why I would prefer coming a bit later. Otherwise, I have some general comments about the presentations. Actually, we have seen some turnarounds with the Gambia Petroleum and Gambia National Petroleum Company that they have declared that they will declare dividend to Gambia government. And there are also, we have seen some improvements in NAWEC's financial statements that has been mentioned earlier, that up to now, they have not defaulted on their repayment obligations to our government. And we are going through the PPP approach at the Gambia Ports Authority. Although we just want to have some little bit of doing the assessment of the fair value of the port. This will be going in tandem with the procurement of a PPP partner for the port. But on there is some little bit of improvements on the clearance of areas between GAMCEL and Gambia government. We intend to clear all the areas we have with GAMCEL by the end of July 2022. On oversight, the SOE Directorate is in the process of being strengthened, both in terms of its manpower and capacity building efforts that is supported by the World Bank and of course by the IMF also. And with the establishment of the SOE Directorate, we have seen some real improvements as far as our relationship with SOEs are concerned. There is more engagements now than before it was created as an SOE Directorate. Now we expect quarterly management reports from SOEs, and this effort will help to strengthen our oversight with state-owned enterprises. And we have started engaging them also on the status of implementation of the Ernst & Young recommendations. This is ongoing, and there will be quarterly meetings that will be held with these SOEs to monitor or assess this status of the implementation of these audit recommendations. Well, as far as the this thing is concerned, the timely auditing of financial statements are concerned, this is really a challenge in this sector. Because most of these state-owned enterprises cannot be audited on time because we have very limited firms in the market, and most of these firms, their services are more attracted by mainly commercial banks. So this brings about a lot of delay in the audit of the financial statements of these SOEs. And you can see recently also at any time that the SOE financial statements are presented to the National Assembly. At the end of the session, the audit reports are normally well published. Yeah, these are the few remarks I have for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, PS. Mewish Abebe has a hard stop and will need to leave. So will I. I suggest you, since the discussion and the interesting part is just starting, I suggest you continue for the next 15 minutes and take over moderation from me and try to engage our guests and presenters before Faye wraps up. If this is acceptable to everybody, to take 15 more minutes to bring this worthy presentation to a good end, then let's do that.
Thank you, Abebe. Thank you, Edward. That's great. Yes, we can continue for 15 minutes if that works with everyone here that is connected.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to leave now. Thank you. Thank you all.
Floor is yours.
Thank you, Edward. So yeah, please feel free to write your questions in the chat. Just pop up your video and ask questions. We have here PS Chalo and colleagues from the government side. We have our colleagues from the IMF still connected. We have the discussants, we have the presenters, we have Faye here. So please feel free to jump in and ask questions. Thank you. And I think Elizabeth wanted to come in. So please feel free to come in, Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay, I have two questions or comments. The first one is in the issue of SOEs having advantage over the private sector, like GAMTEL and GAMCEL, having advantage in terms of their relationship with government. It is mentioned that we have advantage in not paying our taxes or regulatory fee earlier. However, I believe this in the end is paid for, but what I didn't hear is the issue of universal access, where GAMCEL is required to bring services to remote areas where there is no return on investment. The private operator does not do that. I didn't hear that mentioned. And also the other concern is the consolidation of accounts between the parent, GAMTEL and GAMCEL. I don't know how this is going to be done because legally, GAMCEL and GAMTEL are two independent independent liability companies. So I don't see how the consolidation is going to happen, but if someone can advise. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the very good questions. Let's collect a few and then we can go around the table in terms of the responses. I see that in the chat box, there has been a clarification, kind of corroborating the point that PS Jallo made on GNPC. Very well noted, Eligio. Thank you for that. Thank you, Ivo, for also the great collaboration and for joining us today and for still continuing to be there for us for this extra 15 minutes. Any further questions before we start responding to Elizabeth's point? Silence means that you all want to hear the response on Elizabeth's questions for now. So on the advantages, on the universal access, let me turn to Denise, my colleague, if he can briefly respond to that, and then I'll turn to Sandy for the consolidation.
Thank you, Ms.
Denise, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much for the question. This is indeed very key because, as I mentioned during the presentation, the SOEs has this dual role with the public sector obligation and with the commercial activities at the same time. So when we wrote the report, we actually acknowledged that this is a big barrier for the companies to even perform better because they don't have the correct compensation mechanisms in place, and that can distort how the competitive sector also operates. So we acknowledge that in the report. Specifically in the recommendations, we also acknowledge that it's clear that we separate the commercial functions from the public services obligations. And then if we have these two activities separated, then there are other potential solutions in which the company can provide these services for the most vulnerable populations with the minimum risk for distortions in the markets. There are other solutions that we propose in the report to acknowledge for this lack of revenue. There are some alternatives, for instance, in terms of subsidies to the demand, instead of having the SOE having to provide those services, depending on the different type of companies that we observe over the report. So we do take into account the dual role of the public service obligations and how this impacts profitability and also how it impacts performance of these SOEs. So that's why part of the main recommendations for the government is either we can separate either accountable, this separation of the accounts, or we separate these functions in different legal entities in a way that the public service obligations are fully separated with the specific transfers and compensation mechanisms from the other segments that are more on the competitive side. Let me stop there. May wish for you to comment.
So maybe very quickly on the consolidation. I mean, this is a very difficult, challenging aspect. I mean, I think one of the things that we have seen in the financial statement was that when we looked at GAMCEL and GAMTEL, we saw that some numbers were the same for both and some numbers were different. So I think one of the things we can maybe do is really go through just specifically on these accounts and kind of see how we can work through to really bring out the information the accurate information that is needed. At the moment, it seems that it is in a more Excel file. So maybe we can work with you to really look into how we can consolidate this information where possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. Thank you, Sandy. Any more questions? Any more further clarifications? The time is now.
Well, in terms of clarification, I'm not sure with you, but the information we are getting is that the National Food Security Processing and Marketing Company made registered profits, well, have registered profits, but I think these are unaudited financial statements. It's just an information to note. Thank you.
Thank you, PS Jallo. You are very well noted, but as you might have seen, the metric is really the audited financial statements and the statements that have been published. So we're sure that there are a number of reforms that are ongoing right now in the SOE sector, and maybe in a year or 2 years' time, if we do a quick update of this analysis, the picture would be very different than what we have seen now, based on the data that was available.
Hello, good afternoon, Madam Mewis. This is Abdullahi from the Social Security Housing Finance Corporation. Mr. Tambedu.
Yes, Abdullahi. Please come in.
Yes, just a quick one. I wanted to ask, with the very high gearing, the debt to equity of more than 600% at NAWEC, how do they record the loans taken over by government? Is that added into equity? Because I have a feeling that the investments taken over by NAWEC are not capitalized into equity, and because of the low original equity base of the company and the high projects all recorded under debt, their gearing would always be very high. I wanted to know whether those things are added to the equity of NAWEC, which should definitely reduce the gearing.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you for the comment. So we had looked into this data, but let me just give you a sense that at that time, the audited financial statement for 2019 for NAWEC was not available. So whatever data we used was based on the database that is being maintained at the Ministry of Finance and Economic Affairs. Based on that data, and we understand that 75% of the debt was taken over by the government in that MOU, and that has declined the debt stock, and the treatment that was done as part of that MOU in terms of transferring some of the debt as equity for both the government and the NAWEC have also been basically reflected in that data for 2019. But we will see once, and now that the audited financial statement is out for NAWEC for 2019, we will see if that number is still the same, but that's basically the number that was based on the data that available at the time of the assessment.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
I can provide, I mean, if you look at the financial statements, and that's a good illustration of why it's useful to publish. Mr. Abdullahi, sorry, I didn't get you last time. You can see a note 22. It's actually easy to trace that NAWEC, so I'm reading from the website, received a debt relief in 2019 of 4.9 billion local currency. So, and which, so it decreases the debt and it decreases the equity. So debt relief, actually, it reduces the denominator and increases the numerator. So that's why it's so important. It doesn't improve the cash situation of the company, but it certainly is, reduces their financial obligations. So again, kudos to the authorities and also to the team who discussed this with them, because you could see, I mean, you raise a question and I was able to modestly maybe provide an additional answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you for providing quick assessment of the situation there and then. That's the beauty of having experts like you in these kinds of sessions. So any further questions? And I know that we are nearing the end of our extended time for the session. So if there are no further questions, I would like to now invite Faye Borofes to close the session for us and share her remarks with us. But just before passing on the mic to her, I just wanted to check if there are any burning questions that you would like to ask. This is the last chance for all of you.
We can't hear Banjo.
Yeah, it looks like we had a, I think we need to mute. We had a power outage.
You are right.
We're discussing NAWEC and we had a power outage. Is it possible to, I think we have multiple gadgets on. Okay. Yeah, so anyway, I wonder if our NAWEC colleagues are online also. So, you know, basically I started saying that we are asking, you know, some key questions. You know, what activities should the government be engaged in? What services should the government be spending its scarce resources on? You know, there's a whole debate on public versus private provision of services. At the end of the day, because of the profit motive, the private sector will typically provide services more efficiently than the private sector. This is not a Gambia situation. This is just a worldwide, global, human factor. So as the World Bank, we've been discussing what we call the cascade methodology, that the government should spend its scarce fiscal resources on public goods that the market either cannot or will not provide. There was an interesting discussion on, you know, GAMTEL is supposed to provide services for, or GAMCEL is supposed to provide services for rural areas. Those are all important discussions to have. But regardless, even in the case that the government is providing these services, what is happening? For even when the government is supposed to provide those services, how do they do it as effectively and efficiently as possible? So we've had a robust conversation, and I think the report clearly shows that Gambia cannot afford the status quo of its SOEs, right? And also, as we've been discussed by PS Jallo, the government obviously agrees with this, hence the improvements that we've seen over the past few years, starting with the SOE audits, which we found to be very laudable. And in fact, it's well recognized. The fact that it's published, the fact that the SOEs are working on these audit reports is very significant. And this is why we also want to tell the story of the Gambia. It's not just that things are not as they should be, but things are being worked on. There's significant reforms that we've seen with NAWEC. There's significant reforms that we're discussing with others as well. Because at the end of the day, the trade-offs with the SOEs are very significant for the citizens of the Gambia. The Gambia has very limited resources and they should be going towards where they're most needed. We talked about the fact that at some point, SOE expenses are up to 0.75% of the health sector, 33% of education. I think we can all agree that these sectors need, you know, more resources to be spent on them. And so if there are ways to increase efficiency, it's very important for us to do that. Of course, all of these discussions have important implications for policymakers. And again, I just want to say, you know, we recognize what has been done, but there's a lot still to be done. It was very useful to see the example of Nigeria. I have to say, as a Nigerian, we don't have that many good examples, but the telecom sector is one where we've done a lot. And it's great. I've personally witnessed the expansion of the telecom sector across the country. And this has really changed things. So we're hoping to see, you know, a similar story for the Gambia over the next few years. It requires us all, you know, to work together to push forward, you know, important reforms. We think the SOE Directorate is a great step in the right direction. Looking forward to the SOE bill to be passed and the commission to be set up. And we're happy to continue this work on this important agenda. And again, I want to congratulate the team for the report. It's an excellent one and it has been disseminated widely. We'd be happy to share with anyone who's online. If you need a link to the report, it's available for you to review. And the conversation will continue. Thank you. I think Edouard has left, yeah? So with that, I will support the team in wrapping up the session. Thank you all for joining and have a great day.
So much.
الحمد لله رب العالمين عباد الله